Welcome, and you are listening to the Rational Theism podcast. I am your co-host, Tim Howard. I run the channel of Invoking Theism on YouTube, and I am joined with my other co-host, Kyle Allender, who runs the channel of Christian Idealism. This is our first installment of the podcast, and today we'll just be discussing basic intros and the types of things we'll be talking about on the podcast, and everything having to, some basic thoughts on theism, naturalism, God's existence, arguments for God's existence, and so forth. So hope you guys enjoy this first installment.
All right. Hello. You are listening to the Rational Theism podcast. This is going to be our very first episode. And I guess a little background for both of us. So I run a YouTube channel called Christian Idealism. Philosophy, particularly philosophy of religion, is one of my big areas of focus. And so me and Tim here have decided to make this podcast to expose sort of the rich intellectual history and background of theism, which is theism is basically the thesis that there is a God, that God exists. And on this podcast, we're going to go over different things such as the nature of God, certain arguments for God, as well as dealing with objections to God as well. So hopefully this podcast was sort of that our listeners can we can sort of grasp at the concepts. Tim, what about you? What do you think?
Yeah, no, this is good, and I think that having a podcast dedicated to giving an exposure and also a defense of pretty much the cutting edge frontline philosophical ideas as it pertains to theism, and basically showing the rigorousness of theism intellectually is very important. And since my channel is Invoking Theism, that's what I try to do there. So I think combining our efforts here to do that is highly important. One thing I want to make sure that everyone knows is that Kyle and I here, we're not philosophers. We're just two guys who are highly interested and passionate about philosophy, the big questions, foundational truths, truth seeking, and we're Christians, and we do think that the evidence and the data is well in favor of theism over any other competing worldview as an explanation. And so we're aiming to basically give that justification here.
Yeah, and so I think, I guess we could start off with sort of looking at philosophy of religion, like how is it the difference between the philosophers that talk about it versus the popular sort of things you see in culture, right? So I guess first thing, again, I think you made a good point where me and Tim are not philosophers, right? However, we sort of live in both worlds in the sense of we see what's going on in pop culture, but we also sort of see what's going on in the philosophy of religion. I mean, we have contact with a lot of philosophers, few of them like Josh Rasmussen. We talk to him a lot. We also talk to, we've talked to philosophers such as Robert Koons, Alexander Proust. And then, of course, there's other philosophers like Richard Swinburne, William Lane Craig, who are all that work in academia. They're all like professional philosophers. So we read their material, right? So we understand their sort of arguments. We also understand the atheist arguments, right?
Absolutely.
So in the atheist philosophers, I guess we should mention a few of them, which is people like Graham Oppy or Paul Draper or J.L. Schellenberg. These people there's actually, these are the atheist philosophers. And so how philosophers will typically talk about it is it's more dialectic. It's more a lot more progress is made, whereas you see it in culture, it's like, well, not a lot of progress is made. And I think it's unfortunate that that happens, right? But I think our goal, the goal of this podcast is to propose and to I guess expose what is being talked about in the philosophy of religion, like how is theism being progressed, right? Because there's a lot of different, believe it or not, I mean, there's a lot of different views on what God actually is,
Oh
right?
yeah,
So I think that's
absolutely.
another important aspect to it as well.
Yeah, definitely.
So
Models of God is a big debate. The big conversation taking place. There's a variety of models of God, and so when we get into the details and of theism, um, it goes much deeper than that there is a God, but
yeah, it's much deeper. I guess we should say it's much deeper than what you would see in pop culture, right?
right,
Basically.
because I mean, I even made a TikTok about this. I made a TikTok about all the different models of God, and I said, hey, if you're gonna be an atheist, and when I say atheist, I am not referring to this new breed of internet atheism that can rightfully be called lack theism. I'm talking about the classical kind of definition of atheist that someone does not believe in God, believes that no God exists, no God or gods exist. Even if you even have a psychological bent towards disbelief, I even feel like you're in the same camp. That if you're going to say that you don't believe that there's any evidence for God or that the evidence for God is lacking, you need to be specific in what you mean by God. Because as we know, there's pantheism, there's panentheism, there's classical theism, process theism,
Yeah,
there's
there's a lot, which we'll
yes,
get into. We'll discuss those, what those mean in future podcast episodes. But I guess the point to make here is that there's a lot of different models of God. So because there's different models of God, when atheists say they don't believe in God, well, they have to refer to all the models, not just one in particular, right? Um, like for example, I don't consider myself a pantheist, right? I don't think that God is identical to the universe as pantheism would say. Does that mean I'm an atheist? No, I just deny that model of God. So when you're an atheist, it means you deny all models of God, not just any particular model, right? Because a lot of theists, like myself and Tim here, we reject a lot of. There's a lot of models that we don't accept, right? But that doesn't mean we're atheists. It just means that our view of God is sort of different than those models of God. So I think there needs to be that sort of important distinction there.
right. Yeah, and all of this boils down to that, you know, that the universe, the world in which we are always interacting with, uh, space time, the cosmos, is dependent upon there being a being who is eternally existing, beginningless, uh, that is omnipotent, omniscient, wholly good, that is the foundation of reality. That is what we mean when we're talking about God and theism. And then the more specific debates go on about, okay, is God divinely timeless or divinely temporal? Or Craig's view being timeless, sans creation and subsequent to creation, temporal, things of that sort. That's when you get into those more deeper and very more detailed, very specific conversations. I know a lot of people think, well, if there are different models of God, nobody really agrees on who God is. No, there's a foundational, there's core truths here about what it means to be God, um, and so that's what we'll be talking about. That's what we'll be exploring, and of course we'll be talking about where we stand in our position, and how we've kind of arrived at our positions in a sense, and So yeah, those are just the things that the conversation gets very deep, and I feel like, and I know Kyle, you'll agree with me, like it's just the culture is always, and this happens even in any discipline, like we even see this in the sciences, that the culture takes um, quite a long time to catch up to where the fields actually are today. Um, and we see that with
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a really
we
good point, I think.
I see that in evolution, biological evolution, in the biological sciences. We're still teaching Darwin in high schools when Darwin was in the later 1800s. We've progressed quite a lot from Darwin. And evolution from the 21st century looks very different than Darwin, but we're still teaching Darwin in schools and things, and we're not teaching the cutting edge discoveries and where genetics is today, and things of that sort. It's the same thing when it comes to philosophy. We still see remnants of logical positivism um, in in discussions in the culture and things. Where we get things like we have scientism, and I guess the different forms that scientism takes. Those are just remnants, leftovers from logical positivism. But if we know that, if you look into where philosophy is today, metaphysics is a thriving discipline. And
Yeah, so for people that don't know logical positivism, so logical positivism is basically the thesis that that metaphysics is completely meaningless. Like when we're talking about God or ultimate reality or the foundations of reality, like all those are completely meaningless, and so we should only be focused on what we can empirically verify, right? Now, of course, the problem, and this is a problem that's been recognized now for quite some time, but you know the reason why academic philosophers don't take that view seriously is because, well, you can't empirically verify that that verificationism is true, right? So the very idea that in order for something to be meaningful, it has to be empirically verified. Well, you can't empirically verify that principle, right?
right,
So it's ultimately self-defeating, right? And so that's again, philosophers have moved on from that point, but I mean that was a sort of that was a view taken seriously back in the early 20th century.
you had AJ
And
Ayer and things of that sort.
yeah, but now philosophers don't care anymore. Like we've moved on from that. Um, and so now it's kind of like the culture is still sort of catching up um, from that sort of time period. So
Right.
yeah,
And even, um, but it's interesting because, you get into these conversations with these online atheists, the new atheists versus the philosophical atheists. And these new atheists will say things like metaphysics is meaningless, metaphysics is hogwash, as one guy referred to it as. Um, and these things, and this is exactly the attitude of logical positivism, verificationism. And um and what's funny is, you know I don't think they know exactly where they've really inherited their beliefs from on these topics. um
yeah,
and so, but like I said, metaphysics is a thriving field right now. Ontology is a thriving field, and works are being published on it all the time. So, and
yeah,
um, and theism is t- where what's like, what a time to be alive. We have the most theist philosophers in academia than I think there've ever been at a time, and the progress is amazing. Theists are almost now being encouraged to enter into the intellectual public square and to write papers and give their ideas and to have these conversations. So it's just amazing where we're at, and even just the progress in theistic arguments and defense. Like right now, we're seeing a lot of developments in more of a priori type arguments, and rather than relying strictly on, let's say, like, Palean type arguments or notions and things of that sort. Or
Yeah, it's sort of inductive,
yeah,
empirical,
the
or
prop.
arguments that, yeah, which that's a good point because there are different categories of arguments for God, which we'll discuss in future episodes. But I guess the point is like, when it comes to like you look up, let's say you look up the Kalam argument. Well, just the Kalam alone has like so many different versions. Like you'll typically see an atheist sort of like you'll see a blog post or something. It's like, well, I'm going to refute, let's say, Craig's version of the argument, right? Well, you can refute that version, but that's not going to really address other versions, right? Like for example, like Loki's version is sort of a newer version, and his sort of syllogism of the argument bypasses a lot of the contemporary objections that you see in the literature. So just know, like when you say, "Oh, I debunked the Kalam argument," right? It's like, okay, well, which version did you debunk, right? It's like, did you debunk Craig's version, or did you, It's
Right.
like, and that I think that's important to point out because, like if you look again, if you just look up Kalam, you'll probably see like, oh, these supposed refutations, right? And it's just like, well, even if I were to, grant that okay, the argument doesn't work, well, there's plenty of different versions of the argument that are available to the theist, right? So we have to be more careful what we mean by, when we try to debunk
Oh
some
yeah.
argument. So
Absolutely. And it's what's even you know more like interesting is that people think that when you say a lot of people think that when you just say cosmological argument, you're automatically referring to the Kalam, and that is what happened in my debate. Um, when I was doing that tag team debate on proselytize or apostatize, um, I was presenting Rasmussen's perfect foundation argument, and um, and I realized that one of my interlocutors was raising a Kalam type objection that rests on the fact that the universe has a finite history. And I pointed out that my argument does not rest on the premise that the universe has a finite history. And if I read him correctly, he was very surprised.
yeah,
And so I feel like when people think cosmological argument, they think automatically the Kalam. It was even worse than that. It goes back to what you were saying. They actually think about Craig's Kalam.
yeah,
So
like very specific. So even if
yes,
we're not even talking, like it's not just we're not even talking first cause arguments. We're literally talking one version of first cause arguments.
exactly.
So
And people need to understand that the Kalam is honestly a tradition of argument. Um, it's a Kalam argument is basically an argument that argues for a first cause on the basis of the universe having a finite history, and there are many different ways you can go establishing that. Um, um, and so there are like for example, Kuhns and Proust have set out to give atemporal paradoxes that don't even depend on temporal notions, to show that that the uh, that the thesis of causal finitism is the best way to solve these paradoxes, and therefore we should conclude that any causal chain is finite. That's one way to approach the Kalam and things of that sort, but that's less known given
yeah,
Craig's popularity and things. And honestly, we have to give Craig all the credit that's due, because if it wasn't for him, um, these newer arguments couldn't get to where they could be, because they're standing on the backs of like the work that Craig has already done. Like the only reason why we can refine what Craig has done is because Craig actually did the first kind of the groundwork for us. Like in the 70s when
yeah,
he was looking into philosophy of time and those things.
yeah.
So it's just even just more evidence for just progress in one single area of cosmological arguments.
Which there's
Not even getting
there's a
into like
lot of different
contingency
ones.
arguments and things of that sort.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I guess just to I just want our viewers to know, or listeners to know, it's like, when we're talking about arguments, there's like a category of arguments, but then there's also developments going on within each of those, right? Now, I should also mention, because this is the first episode, I don't want to get too much into the arguments themselves, but at least on the theistic side, there's also the atheistic side of the spectrum, where you have arguments like the problem of evil type of arguments, or divine hiddenness sort of arguments, and we will try to address those in this podcast, right? But I think I want to give some credit to the atheists as well. It's like, well, even though theists have a lot of these arguments, well, atheists also have a lot of arguments on their side, and I think that should be acknowledged, right? Mm-hmm. So, for example, like the problem of evil has different versions. So you have the logical problem of evil, which is basically try to argue that it's logically impossible for God to be all good, all powerful, and for evil to exist. Or you go with a more sort of evidential approach, where you say it's not as likely, or at least that naturalism or the hypothesis that there is no God is a better explanation than there is a God for explaining evil, right? And then, of course, there's different versions of arguments from evil, right? So it's not just, we're talking about the problem of evil, we're not just talking about one specific argument, we're talking about a class of arguments, right? So I think that's an important thing to point out here, is when we're talking about any sort of arguments within the philosophy of religion, typically it's referring to a category of arguments rather than a specific one. So I don't know, what do you think, Tim? Do you think, the atheists have a good sort of approach as well?
Yeah, I think that you can group atheist arguments into two categories. You can internal critiques and arguments from evil. And as far as I know, that is the best way to systematize it, because
so this is my proposal. Well, I don't know if you would, I'm sure you would agree with me, Tim, but for me, this is how I see it. So when it comes to the atheist, right, for their side, this is how I see it. So if you look at it, it's kind of like you have to look at it as like a soccer game. This sounds kind of weird, but bear with me. So basically, you have a defense, right? So the defense for the atheists would be, let's say, the simplicity of naturalism, and this is something that someone like Graham Oppy argues for in his book, The Best Argument Against God, where he basically argues in simple terms. Again, we can do a whole podcast episode on just this alone, but if we're talking about his argument, right? So it's about the simplicity of naturalism, that given that naturalism can explain all facts about the world, but because it's categorically simple, meaning that naturalism only requires natural things to exist, then therefore naturalism is a simpler hypothesis. And so that would be a defense of the proposition that there is no God, right? Because if you're a naturalist, then you wouldn't believe in a God, right? Because, God isn't natural, at least according to that sort of view. So that's the defense, right? That's typically the defense you'll see. And then when it comes to the offense, it's typically problem of evil type arguments, right? Where you basically show an inconsistency within theism, and then, or you can bring in the divine hiddenness arguments, right? And still show some sort of inconsistency. So that's how I see it. That basically the defense would be the simplicity of naturalism, and then the offense would be the problem of evil type of arguments. Now, when it comes to the theistic side of the spectrum, I think it's a little more complicated, because first of all, there's a lot more arguments for theism, but typically the best ones that I think, like, for example, like one of my favorite arguments for theism is Richard Swinburne's approach, where he uses some sort of cumulative case, right? So I think the defense for theism would be some sort of cumulative case, whereas the offense, I think it's kind of because there it's more difficult because if you're comparing worldviews, I think a cumulative case could also be a defense and an offense. So I'm not sure
Yeah, it's
if
interesting.
it's more on the theistic side. It's not as clear if one side of our like if you can use one set of arguments just for critiquing or something, if you can use it just for attacking the other position, or if you can also use it for defending your position. I don't know. What do you think? It's sort of complicated on that
Yeah,
part.
I see that there's a variety of ways that theism is defended, um, especially when you get into apologetics. So, you have cumulative case approaches, and then you'll have like classical approaches, which is somebody like William Lane Craig, who who doesn't do the cumulative approach, but rather he gives a variety of arguments that um, that show that uses an inference to the best explanation, and these arguments are usually of the deductive type, of the deductive kind. So Craig will use the universe having beginnings best explained by God, fine tunings best explained by God, morality is best explained by God, resurrection, things of that sort.
Yeah,
That's a classical approach where you have a multiplicity of arguments in favor of God's existence. Um, um, and then and I feel like evidential cases, um, you know, fit somewhere in there. Um, but Swinburne. The reason why there's something to say about Swinburne being as successful as he has been with the way that he's formulated his arguments, which is by taking a likelihood approach. The Bayesian type things. That
yeah,
each that we have a set of facts, we have data, and when we look at the datum, you know, and we do our hypothesis testing, they incrementally for a given fact are able to raise the probability a certain amount.
yeah. It's
Um,
it's he uses a very scientific approach
right. And
to it.
what's
So
really interesting, if you really follow what's going on in at the front lines of theism right now, is Graham Oppy has done a lot to basically kind of point theists in that direction. Um, I mean, I've heard Rasmussen say that he sees Graham Oppy as somebody who's comes alongside theists and like helps them almost.
I
Um,
agree. I
be,
definitely, I'm totally on board with you on that. That he's really Graham Oppy. Like that's probably why he's my favorite atheist philosopher. It's like he has really helped refine my theism in ways that I don't think I could have done. So
yeah, right. And it's like, Graham is saying, okay, well, let's look at these virtues, let's look at these principles. And, Swinburne, basically did that. He says, I mean, even the same thing with philosopher Trent Doherty. I remember in his conversation with Tom Jump, he said to him, my religious epistemology is exactly that of science. So when we look at how we approach these things, um, Swinburne's case, he takes the set of facts, and then he weighs the respective likelihoods, probabilities, given the hypothesis of theism, on the evidence and things of that sort. And then, cumulatively together, they they are to add up to be a very simple kind of explanation. Or he would say, Richard Swinburne would say, the simplest kind of explanation. Um,
yeah, which there we could have we could have a whole podcast episode on just simplicity, which I'm sure we can discuss that. What do we mean by simplicity? What is a good simple theory? right? So I mean that's a whole again. This is why the podcast
Exists.
exists basically, right? Is we're going to be talking a lot about these concepts. So we may be talking about some of it now, but trust me, later down the line, we're going to definitely be going more in detail on each specific sort of point we're making here. But yeah, I mean, I think the overall picture we want to sort of get to the listeners is like, this is what's going on in the philosophy of religion is like, basically, it's, I mean, yes, people are talking about arguments, right? But it's also about those theoretic virtues and looking at it in a more sort of scientific way, right? Where basically like, okay, you want to test or not test in the empirical sense, but test in a more philosophical or inductive sense where it's like, well, given the hypothesis of theism, what am I going to expect to see in the world, right? And sort of these general facts about the world, right? And so that's what's going on with within the philosophy of religion, at least in the front lines, right? So yeah.
No, absolutely.
Because I think another thing I want to point out here is, I mean, we have been talking a lot about arguments in this episode, but I think another important thing to realize here is a lot of the progress is while I would say that arguments do bring progress, I also think that what's called principles or philosophical principles also bring probably more progress in my opinion. So for example, and this is probably like one of my favorite examples where, so right now within philosophy of religion, both theists and atheists, so both the people that do believe in God and people that don't believe in God, they agree, at least there's like a sort of consensus that stage one contingency arguments work, like that we can at least get to some sort of necessary foundation, or there's some necessary thing in nature, right? And the way that consensus was reached was basically with the PSR, the principle of sufficient reason, that for every contingent fact about the world, that there must be some explanation of that contingent fact. And so, if every contingent fact needs an explanation, well, you're going to have to get to something that's sort of necessary, right? Something that has to exist by its own necessity, right? So just that principle alone already gets you to a sort of like necessary foundation. And so now the discussion within philosophy of religion is what's called stage two contingency arguments, where it's trying to identify what is the necessary foundation. And so, a theist like us, we would say that the necessary foundation is God, whereas a naturalist would say that it's, something else. But yeah, I mean, it's progress, right? So what do you think, Tim?
Sorry, I just had to unplug my
Oh, okay. I was a little worried there for a second, but
no.
But yeah,
Yeah, no, progress is being made, and I mean, it even goes in the other direction. I recall Graham saying to Koons that if it wasn't for his interaction with the theists, that he would have the certain views he has, like for example about modality, taking more of like a modal realism, and things that so these interactions cut both ways. And then I mean, we've talked about this before, but going back to the whole the culture always catching up to where the field is at right now, and when we see that the conversation taking place online, theism versus atheism, is just a continuation, just a watered down continuation of Swinburne and Mackey's back and forth. And so
yeah.
We see that in things in many different facets, in many different forms, and I think that is and so as
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, you can keep on talking, but I'm gonna try to find that quote that I sent you a few weeks. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, so we've been talking about Swinburne a lot, but another important figure, unfortunately, he he's not around anymore, but his name was John Mackey, and Mackey was sort of the founder. I would call him the founder of analytic atheist philosophy, because his sort of contribution to the philosophy of religion has been very, very sort of helpful on the atheist side. Whereas Swinburne and as well as like Alvin Plantinga, so they would represent the theistic side, whereas Mackey would represent the atheist side within the philosophy of religion. And so, yeah, I mean, I think you make a good point that, like, when it comes to discussions, right, it's literally just a continuation of that discussion between Mackey and Oppie. Oh, no, not Mac, but Mackey and Richard Swinburne. So, so that's what I would say. But
Yeah.
I still can't. Yeah. I still can't find that quote. It's kind of okay. Here it is. I found it. Oh, okay. Never mind. Then I was definitely wrong. I could not find it. I thought I did. It's like way up here. Okay, I found it. Sorry. How much? By the way, how much time do we have left?
Yeah, so
Tim?
we are at 35 minutes.
Okay, we got plenty of time. So we got 25 minutes
Sure.
to go. Okay. So this is, I guess, because I think this is really important to point out here. So one of the cutting, edge topics within discussions regarding naturalism versus theism is which theories have greater simplicity, right? So this is a quote from, now I just want to be clear that the quote I'm getting from here is actually from a Facebook group, so I don't actually have this book, but I thought this was really important to sort of point out. So this is what they say, that, hold on, let me see. Okay, so it says, quote, "One of the keys to Swinburne's position in his view is that the theist hypothesis is simple. He identifies two forms of explanations. First is the inanimate, which explains an event in terms of powers and liabilities, or simply the laws of nature and initial events as causes of events." So I guess just to sort of boil down what that means. So basically what that means is Swinburne recognizes the sort of event causation, right? Or a sort of scientific explanation of things. But then a second type of explanation would be a personal explanation. And so this explains an event in terms of not only powers, but of purposes, beliefs, and intentions. So both forms of these sort of explanations are sort of, we can see it in real life, right? So, if you see a sort of painting, like, we don't assume that, like, nature just, randomly just got the painting there perfect. We assume that there was actually a person that drew the painting, right? So this is what Swinburne sort of uses, sort of reasoning, where in scientific reasoning, if each theory explains the relevant data equally, the best theory is that which fits well with the background knowledge and is best known to be the simplest. And so simplicity then becomes the critical sort of like point for which hypothesis is better, right? And so then, Richard Swinburne then argues that against the materialists and against the naturalists, that materialism remains a very complicated hypothesis in postulating that complete causes of things now are innumerable separate objects. So basically, the naturalist has to posit a bunch of fundamental necessary entities. So that's not a simple hypothesis. Whereas God would be a very simple hypothesis, because theism would claim that every other object that exists in the universe is caused to exist by the simple being, which is God, right? So it's talking about basically, when we're talking about fundamental entities, that God would be a simpler hypothesis because of the fact that that it's just one sort of fundamental entity rather than a bunch of fundamental entities. And so, continuing on the quote here, he says, he then argues that the theist hypothesis is made even simpler because this God has infinite power, infinite knowledge, and infinite freedom, insofar as it is logically possible to act and know and consistent with God's own character and purposes. Furthermore, it is simpler to suppose that God is eternal and possesses these divine traits essentially. Now, this is from Swinburne's view. What do you think? Sorry, did you want to add anything,
No,
Tim?
I wanted to add, which is it's very important to point this out, that the kind of the entity that's doing the explaining, given its talked about, an entity that is infinite,
Yeah.
is much simpler than something with a finitely degreed set of properties. And this is something that theists are starting to catch on to in terms of, the virtuousness of how our theory is more virtuous. Swinburne advocates for this. Kuhn's advocates for this, and Rasmussen most certainly advocates for this. So, and that is something that all theists, when giving defense for theism, should follow suit in, because there's something about either, let's take something like extension, for example, something with extension. No extension is simpler than extension of, let's say, of 5 feet, for example. And just like how no extension is simpler than some amount of extension that could be more so or less so, infinite extension is likewise simpler as well than more so some extension that could be, somewhat more or somewhat less. So in infinities or things with things just with non-finitely degreed properties are much more simple than ones that are. And Swinburne, Rasmussen, and Kuhn's incorporate this into their defenses. And as we know, Josh and his argument for arbitrary limits, and
which
so
we can do there's like a whole episode we could do just on that argument. Which
exactly, and we'll definitely need to have him on for that one.
We're gonna but you get my point. So
and so this is something that is important to point out. And that's the thing that's going to take the cake at the end of the day and make theism more attractive in the end.
Now, I also want to point out to my viewers here, we're trying to represent both views. So that's the theistic side. So that's sort of our perspective. Now, more could be said on that, and I think we're gonna do a podcast episode just on the simplicity of theism. But now I'm gonna continue on the quote, and so we'll get what the naturalist has to say. And then I'll also add in what someone like Graham Oppy would have to say, because I think what he says is also important. So just continuing on. Now, Mackey, of course, would easily resort that such a hypothesis is not simple, because after all, it postulates an entity to explain what may be explained without it. If, say, science can eventually explain everything by reference to the relevant laws of nature, or principles that describe the workings of the universe, what is the point in postulating an additional entity like God? Furthermore, why would a disembodied, omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly free, and eternal person be simpler? Does this not make this unique being highly improbable? After all, we have no experience of beings with the same or even comparably similar traits. The only persons we know through sense experience are human beings who are embodied and limited. However, Swinburne and Mackey employ the term simplicity in misleadingly different ways. For Mackey, the theistic hypothesis is not simple because God is a postulation of the unwarranted entity, and a rather puzzling one at that, in addition to the universe. This assumption is made apparent throughout his arguments in The Miracle of Theism, but he makes it explicit when he characterizes Swinburne arguments. And indeed, every theistic argument other than Berkeley's idealism as that which adds God to the universe. For Swinburne, the simplicity of the theistic hypothesis is the simplicity of its ultimate explanation. This is a fundamental yet seemingly often overlooked difference. Thus, Richard Macer in Does God Existence Need Proof comments, quote, "This difference is rarely observed. Swinburne's principle of simplicity looks for the simplest possible final explanation. Mackey's Occam's razor looks for no unwarranted multiplication of entities in an explanation." So that's the views, right? So, and then I should also sort of add, on top of what Mackey has to say about simplicity, so someone like Graham Oppy would argue this same point as well. And this is probably like his number one main point in the best argument against God, where when we're talking about categorical simplicity, so the kinds of entities that each theory has to postulate, according to him, right, since God is a supernatural being, then he's not categorically the same as the natural, and thus naturalism is simpler because it only has one kind of thing, whereas on theism you have, one kind of thing, which is the natural, but then you have this other kind of thing, which is the supernatural. Now, of course, so this is where we're going to have to start talking about our preferred model of God, because I would actually agree with Oppy that if we're going to make those sort of categorical distinctions, then we're going to run into problems. And that's why me and Tim here are both monists, right? So we both think that theism, at least that God is not a different kind of thing as compared to what we already observed.
Yeah, and especially if the naturalist incorporates Leon's principle of material causality, it's going to really strengthen that case for the naturalist. And so that is something that I would take seriously. I was having a conversation today on Twitter with someone who was asking me, how do you respond to the dualist to the objections to dualism, such as the interaction problem? How does but it was in relation to God and the universe. The universe is supposed to be material, and God is supposed to be immaterial. But how does the interaction occur? And I told him, there are many ways you can go about this. You can either say something like, we might not know epistemically how, but it's the inference to the best explanation. I told him that was not my preferred view. What you could do is you could just simply opt in that reality is one category of thing, and you can just start with that and say, I'm going to say that the categorical distinctions are too ambiguous, and so I'm not even going to subject myself to multiple categories. I'm just going to say there's one category, and I'm just going to just say that the difference between a naturalism, that kind of atheism, versus a theism is the nature of our foundations. And so you could go there, and that would basically bypass everything. That would bypass those kinds of objections.
So I guess I think you brought up a good point with regards to the material causality. So I guess for the viewer's sake, so the principle of material causality states that everything with an originating or sustaining cause has a material cause for its existence. Now, I just want to be clear. So when he's talking about material cause, he's talking about the same kind of thing, right? So when we're talking about material cause, we're not talking about material cause in the sense of materialism, right? Where everything is material in the material sense, but rather basically that everything is made of the same kind of stuff, right? I think that's a more nuanced sort of view. I still do like calling it the principle of material causality, because that's typically how most people sort of think about the same kind of stuff.
You could just say that that it's a principle that says that if there is a causal order, the causal order is going to consist of the same kind of thing, categorically,
Right.
and that would then yeah, that would make sense. That's really what it's getting at.
Yeah, and I really like it because it sort of narrows down. It actually, I think it sort of helps the theist in a way because it sort of narrows down which models of God we should get rid of and which ones we should prefer. And so, um, that's why I think, at least, that a sort of monistic view of sort of monistic theism is going to be more preferable than a sort of dualistic theism. So I just want to make that clear to the listeners that me and Tim we're gonna be advocating a more monistic view of things because I think our sort of model of God bypasses a lot of the objections from naturalists. So that's what we're trying to figure out like what's the best model of God, right? So we think the best model of God is going to be monistic in nature, right? So that's what we're going to be pushing in this podcast for. But yeah,
Yep.
what do you think, Tim,
No.
about that?
Yeah. I think it does help, and it narrows down the conversation to let fewer talking points, but ones that really do matter the most.
Yeah.
And because, would you rather have a conversation defending the supernatural natural distinction, or would you rather have a conversation about the okay, well, what are we both agree that there are foundations, but like, what is the nature of our foundations, and which one is does the better job at explaining, things of that sort. You can bypass those things and get to those things much easier. And so I feel like that helps, and it's also something to point out, which is, a kind of dualist reality is I feel like a kind of dualist reality is something interesting because I don't think Kyle Vollmer was actually saying this. He posted this in the Reason and Religion. He said that, it doesn't seem that dualism is really gives theism any predictive power whatsoever. And I agree and I agree. It's kind of interesting that you could make arguments that there needs to be this, there needs to be a material and an immaterial distinction. But it doesn't seem like it's anything that follows from the idea that God creates a world. It seems that the more modest thing to say is that if God creates a world, no new categories are introduced. Ontological categories are introduced.
Right.
So it helps kind of clarify on those parts, and then it might, like it did for me, get me into the camp of understanding, okay, yeah, having a monistic ontology seems to be something much more attractive than kind of a dualist way to look at reality, fundamentally, in the fundamental sense. And so, and then of course, it also helps, helps bridge, what seemed might be large gaps between the theist and the naturalist, the theist and the atheist, and shrinks those a bit, and you guys are on creates more common ground and more common beliefs, and things like that.
No, yeah, because we mentioned this earlier about how we want to make progress, right? So this is how you make progress: is basically come to a shared understanding of what we mean by ontology and like what is our sort of. Now, I just want to be clear: ontology is the study of what the nature of what things are, right? In case no one really understood what that term means, but basically, we want to come to a sort of shared view about the kind of stuff we're talking about, right? And so when we're talking about what is the universe made of, or what is the nature of matter, right? I think naturalists and theists could agree that the nature of reality is one in kind, right? So there's no two ontologically different things, right? So I think that's definitely a progress in the right direction. So
Yep. Yeah, that's very good. Um, so we're at about 54 minutes here. Um, we covered quite a bit.
yeah,
And
we
you know
did.
we've
A
set the
good start.
stage. Yeah, exactly. We've set the stage for a lot of things. And especially one thing to be looking forward to here is some a lot of good conversations having to do with the philosophy of mind. That's definitely something that we'll be discussing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think our next episode, or at least maybe a few episodes down the line, we should discuss that sort of thing, the nature of consciousness, right? Because that's also a subject that I really, really enjoy. I mean, I have a YouTube channel, Christian Idealism, and like that's one of my big sort of things is the nature of consciousness, right? And I think consciousness itself has implications for not just the existence of God, but like just the nature of what reality is, right? So we could certainly discuss that probably in the next episode if you want, or what do you want to talk about next?
Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah, because Kyle and I here, we are both idealists. Um, some people think it's better to refer to it as ideists or mentalists or things of that sort. But idealism is usually the proper term. And so we're gonna have, um, um, you know, quite a lot to say in regards to the philosophy of mind, and so that's gonna be something almost kind of essential to our our
Yeah,
podcasting.
it's gonna be essential to our podcast, especially. I mean, I've already mentioned in plenty of times that Graham Oppy's main objection to theism is that it's not simple, categorically speaking. Well, idealism gets past that problem. That's what's real. That's what I really like about it. It sort of bypasses a lot of naturalist arguments,
It does.
right? So that's why we're gonna find it. I think in order to boost theism, right? So the one way to really show that theism is the best hypothesis of the world is to be, to also push this idealist ontology, right? That all is sort of all is mental and all is consciousness. But yeah, I mean, we can discuss that in the future episodes. So we'll definitely get to that.
Yeah.
But yeah.
For sure. And then of course I think it would be so cool to also approach the philosophy of time. Philosophy of time is really hard. That's
Yeah.
just one thing. It's
Yeah.
really hard, but it's also extremely fascinating. And just understanding the ontology of time is fascinating. Um, and so yeah, we've pretty much set the stage, for quite a few things that we'll be talking about in the future and what people could expect. So I feel like we've done a good job at doing that. And yeah, I mean, I don't really have anything much else to add, besides the fact that there's a lot in store, and people should be you know um, following and subscribing, and and making sure that this podcast can actually be circulated and be exposed, have a greater exposure.
Yeah. All right. Well, that'll be the end for episode 1 of this podcast. Have a nice day, guys. I hope I'll see. Well, please follow us and subscribe to both of our YouTube channels. So I'm Christian Idealism. Tim, if you want to close off.
Yeah, and I'm from Invoking